at 11 o'clock. So we'll have just two presentations before the break, and after that we have that. Now, most of the European policies recognize that artists and cultural expression are constitutive of a free democratic society. Is this so? Do the arts and culture promote democracy? I think we have with a provoking statement. This provoking statement comes from Professor Dr. Sjaak Koenis, who's our next speaker, who will be talking about this topic. Professor Koenis is a professor of social philosophy, especially focused on the relation between politics and culture at the Maastricht University. He's editor of Philosophy and Practice, a Dutch quarterly journal that addresses practical problems with social or political concern. Please welcome with me Professor Koenis. Professor, you have 30 minutes. He has already taken 2 minutes, but we have 30 minutes.
Well,
you can use 20 minutes if you want to, and 10
yeah,
minutes for that.
I'll need 20 minutes. First of all, I want to thank you for the organization for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here. The questions I want to raise and at least try to begin to answer them are: do the arts and culture promote citizenship and democracy? Are the arts and humanities good for democracy? Will they produce better citizens? Most of us sitting here, we may be working in arts and humanities departments, we may be working for cultural organizations, so I think we all have a stake in a positive answer to this question. And surely, yes, isn't it plausible that education in the arts and humanities will improve the quality of democracy? Now, before I get to at least the beginning of an answer to these questions, I would just like to outline what I'm going to do in this lecture. Basically, I'm going to focus on three questions. First of all, and basically they're all comments about democracy, and it is about democracy from, let's say, a more Western, maybe a Western European perspective on the history of democracy. So it is a bit parochial maybe, but that's what I'm talking about. First of all, very long time, cultivated intellectuals in the history of the West were not very positive about democracy. That's one point I will try to make. So if we focus on, let's say, the arts and then specifically the high culture, people that embrace that have not usually been very, let's say, positive about democracy. That's one thing. And to understand why, I think we have to take a closer look at democracy itself. I think, on the one hand, it is, of course, good for emancipation, for equality, for liberty, also for cultural diversity, I think. But it also has a downside, which people usually don't talk about. It also breeds, I think, resentment. It also breeds jealousy, basically because it breeds competition among people. It also breeds, I would claim, let's say, also sort of tension against outsiders. Okay, that's the second point I tried to make. And the third point is a more positive one, optimistic one. If you're interested in innovation in politics and culture, I think we should more focus on the effects of popular culture. Whatever comes from the bottom, I think, has more potential to innovate. Okay, let's go to the lecture. I start out with referring to a book by the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. You probably know it, Not for Profit. It's a defense of the humanities, also a liberal education. And she became, with this book, one of the most outspoken advocates of a humanistic liberal education. According to Nussbaum, students learn to see the world with the eyes of the others. They learn that caring for the needs of others is not a sign of weakness, and that weakness itself is not a reason for shame. A liberal education, he claims, develops the ability to really care for others and not to see minorities as less than equal. And finally, it promotes critical thinking and the ability to differ of opinion. I do not deny any of these claims. I think, yes, this is all good for democracy. Well-educated citizens probably will have less problems with recognizing the rights, equal rights of others. They care for others' lives and critically examine also probably more the claims and the positions of their leaders. And also they see their country as part of the world as a whole. So yes, also they will more likely embrace a more cosmopolitan position and engagement with the rest of humanity, and probably also better to resist the attractions of xenophobia, which has recently resurfaced in many Western countries. This may all be true, but the question is what all this has to do with the realities of democracy as we know it today. In the book of Nussbaum, democracy emerges as a form of civilized conversation, separated from the harsh outside world and conducted between well-cultivated and educated citizens who in their formative years have been really well exposed to the abundance of art and culture. But outside of this protective shell, democracy looks different. And I think also happily so. I embrace that. If it were no more than the civilized conversation of the cultural elite, democracy would never have become as strong and vibrant as it is today, at least in some places. And even within our universities, with their overrepresentation of well-educated citizens, the internal democracy displays many of the same features as external democracy. People are mostly working for their own interests. They are jealous of the accomplishments of others and are only willing to do something for others as long as they themselves are valued as well by their colleagues and if their interests are taken into account. So the weak spot in Nussbaum's arguments, I think, is that she has a very restricted view of democracy, modern democracy. She defends an Enlightenment idea of democracy, of citizenship. If citizens are well educated, they will want the best for each other and the world. They will overcome their primary fears, their narcissism, helplessness, their shame and disgust, and are capable of compassion for others. In the universe of Nussbaum, there basically are no angry citizens. While it is this group of angry citizens which has recently become very vocal, for instance, in my own country, the Netherlands, with the rise of populism of people like Pim Fortuyn and Geert Wilders. Okay, so against this fairly rosy picture of the enlightened citizens who naturally embrace democracy, I want to defend the claim that the existence of these enlightened citizens is not a sufficient nor a necessary condition for a democratic society. No sufficient condition because we are all familiar with the example of cultivated Nazi officers who had no problem whatsoever with torture and murder and didn't care about democracy whatsoever. Against this, Nussbaum might point out, well, they didn't get the right proper humanistic education, or probably, or certainly, they were also poisoned by fascism. This may have been the case, but it remains a fact that in history, and then I'm talking about the history of Western Europe mainly, that in history, many very cultivated intellectuals have rejected democracy. Plato probably be the first one. And if Nazi officers are an extreme example, which I think it is, let's listen to scholars like Zeev Czernel or Stephen Holmes, who studied the work of all those very cultivated intellectuals who have played an important role in the anti-liberal and anti-democratic tradition. As a matter of fact, I would claim that in Western Europe, only after the Second World War, we can speak of a reconciliation between high culture and democracy. Before the 1930s, 40s, the odds that cultivated intellectuals were against democracy was higher than that they would embrace or celebrate it. And even now, if I look around me, disdain for democracy resurfaces every now and then in the criticism that intellectuals level against the superficial and materialistic popular culture. And an example of my own country would be a tract written by the director of the Nexus Institute, Rob Riemen. He not only equates populism with fascism, which I think is wrong, but he also repeats all the classical stereotypes about the superficial and materialistic mass culture we know from the conservative Kulturkritik. So, my second point, the existence of a well-educated and enlightened citizens is also not a necessary condition for democracy. The vitality and vibrancy of democracy I referred to earlier can also be explained by the fact that every once in a while political democracy has been enriched by the contributions of these very angry citizens I talked about earlier. Populists have often given voice to these angry citizens, directed against the well-educated citizens who were perfectly happy with a closed political elite. So what makes democracy thrive? If I might take the Netherlands as an example, the historian Henk de Velde has showed that there are at least 3 periods in our history where you could say that populist movements have really shaken up our democracy and have improved it, have made it more democratic, more lively, and also less elitist. I won't go into these 3 periods. Maybe the last one, if I focus on the populists of the brand of Pim Fortuyn and Geert Wilders, they're usually very much frowned upon because, well, they surely also have very negative attitude towards foreigners. In the Netherlands, basically against the Greeks, against the Turkish and the Moroccan migrants. But also recently, he sort of turned his criticism against the Greeks. But at the same time, these populists have also opened up democracy in the Netherlands to the extent that they managed to break open a sort of inbuilt tendency in Dutch democracy to sort of reserve democracy for a political elite. So they break it open, they criticize the position of the established elite at the same time. So my point would be populism, and if we look at the history of the Netherlands, there has been populist type of socialist movements, also Orthodox Protestant movements, which were also very much led by populist leaders. They have enriched democracy as well. So populism, for my purposes, is not all good and also not all bad either. And I think such a mixed judgment is also relevant with respect to democracy in general. Of course, if we look at the struggle of workers, of women, for emancipation, and in the case of the Netherlands, also the struggle for religious minorities to be accepted by the plurality, by the majority. This struggle for emancipation is an important source of democracy, and it strengthens democracy. But it's not the only source. Apart from emancipation, cultural diversity, etc., also less lofty things like jealousy and resentment form an important source of democracy. The same Rousseau, who is quoted by Nussbaum as a source of inspiration for education, explains in his discourse on the origin of inequality that civilization breeds mutual jealousy also. It does so because it enhances ambition. And the desire for reputation, honor and advancement, and because people can only, according to Rousseau, people can only appreciate what they have to the extent that others don't have it. So that's a sort of a sobering comment on democracy. And not only Rousseau pointed to this, what I would like to call social jealousy. In his famous book on democracy in America in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville showed that democracy will stimulate more competition and resentment among citizens, even though he was very positive about democracy. But he also saw this downside. I quote, "One must not blind oneself to the fact that democratic institutions promote to a very high degree the feeling of envy in the human heart. Not so much because they offer each citizen ways of being equal, they also do that to each other, but because these ways continually prove inadequate for those who use them. Democratic institutions awaken and flatter the passion of equality, which is good, without ever being able to satisfy it entirely, which breeds this unrest, this resentment." And I think if we, this is a quote from the 1830s, if we look at our modern day societies, this competition of all against all has been strengthened to a great degree also. I won't go into that. The traditional religious and ideological fault lines have faded away. So the Dutch society used to be very much a pillarized society with religious communities sort of standing next to each other, not very much integrated. But that has changed now. We come across new divides, like a very important one, a divide between low and high educated citizens, which is a very troublesome divide that we're facing right now. I think if we look at the new media also, they enhance this competition of all against all. They not only witness, I would claim, to the emancipation of individuals, but at the same time they also are a new source of anger and resentment. Instead of seeing democracy as a natural habitat for enlightened citizens who struggle for equality, emancipation, all these things that we think are very good, peaceful cohabitation, cultural tolerance, etc., I think we would do better to see democracy as a political system with two faces, or even better, a Janus face, because these two faces are very much interconnected also. One face shows enlightenment, equality, freedom, emancipation, tolerance, and the other face shows discontent, resentment, distrust also of strangers, for instance, by this very same democracy. I think we tend to keep these two faces too much apart. The enlightened friends of democracy are in that case given the task to fight for enlightenment and all these other good things, whereas the enemies of democracy, like the populists as they are portrayed, are reproached for the fact that all they do is cultivate discontent and resentment. But I would claim populism is part of democracy. It has always been so. Just like the strive for equality and emancipation on the one hand and resentment on the other are also intimately connected. So my problem with Nussbaum is that she only sees the first phase, the happy phase of democracy, while she underestimates the productive power of the second phase. Okay, and now I'm going to talk about culture a little bit more. It's not just the conception of democracy that people like Nussbaum and all those who embrace the importance of the arts and humanities for democracy that is too limited. I also think that their conception of culture is too limited. Culture refers in her book mainly to what you could call monumental culture, high culture, the best that has been produced by philosophy, the arts, and culture. Whereas popular culture is not taken into account. And in this they find themselves unwillingly in the same camp as those intellectuals who before World War II were skeptical of democracy because it left no room, because it left too much room for popular or mass culture. Take for instance Thomas Mann, not the celebrated writer who in the 1940s wholeheartedly embraced democracy when he was in America, but the pre-war conservative cultural critic who in Betrachtungen eines Unpolitischen writes that the danger of democracy is that all important values will become merely a matter of opinion and democratic consent. So not the good taste of the cultural connoisseur, but the vulgar taste of the ordinary people would make the difference in democracy. Now, the mistake they make, I think, is that it is precisely in popular culture that new front lines of our future democracy will surface. In politics, populism gives voice to the angry citizens so that they can express their concern about the process of globalization and migration, which seems to jeopardize so much of what they love and are familiar with. In the same way, I think popular culture gives voice to various kinds of sentiments, of which resentment is one, only one. I think, for instance, of those television programs in the Netherlands about the Dutch song, in which autochthone Dutch artists perform for a very white audience. I think of the popularity of André Rieu, for instance, popular films, Dutch musicals, which, not by coincidence, became popular with autochthone Dutch citizens at around the same time that Pim Fortuyn became popular. I'm almost finished, but the conclusions are important. Popular culture is not just an outlet for resentment of the autochthone citizens, although the new media, blogs, Twitter, etc., are very suitable for new ways of expressing resentment as well, avoiding the traditional selection mechanisms of traditional media. I think popular culture is also the medium where new stuff develops, where experiments with new forms of culture and art are being performed, where they create new communities and also new social ties. So, just to come up with one conclusion which I think captures the point I'm trying to make, a quote from Robert Hughes. He's a critic, Australian critic who just recently passed away. He said in a wonderful lecture about the myth of high and low referring to culture there, he said, he explains how the arts blossom thanks to the constant interaction of high and low. I quote, "For it is the lesson of modernism that these so-called intrusions from below, from popular culture, just think of jazz in the 1920s, for instance, lots of other examples, have led to great clarifications, to expansions of language, to leaps of vividness that an immutably Mandarin culture, high culture, fixated on its own notions of high art alone, cannot produce." In a similar way, I want to defend the claim that democracy thrives because of the constant interaction between the elite and the people, between the power positions of the established elites who feel that they know what is best for the people, and the agitations of people who every now and then just don't accept it anymore. It's popular culture, and in politics also populist movements, where the second phase of democracy, the one that displays discontent, manifests itself most vividly today. But at the same time, it also testifies to the emancipation of individuals. In short, instead of singling out our democracies, in our democracies, a privileged place for citizens enlightened by the arts and humanities, we would do better to keep an open eye to the dynamic interaction between high and low in culture and between the elite and the people in politics. Innovation in our culture and democracy usually works bottom up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. We take questions from the audience. Any question? Yes, please.
Just more a comment, since it's relevant to your presentation and the previous ones this morning. In 2011, I launched what was known as the Irish Spring. It didn't get much recognition because it was using social media democratically for the economic purposes of a country. and it's a very good empirical example, actually, Timo, of how you can leverage social media. Twitter were looking to set up a European base somewhere in the European Union. They had a small office in London. The British government were offering them development grants to come to London. Myself and a few friends were looking at the Arab Spring, and we thought, what if a nation used social media, bottom up, like you said, bottom up innovation, for economic purposes? So we launched a campaign to Twitter with Love, let's tweet Twitter to Dublin. Within a very short space of time, we mobilized thousands of people internationally on Twitter, including in England, ironically enough, and in Northern Ireland. So it goes to show how you can leverage social media across other cultures that that you mightn't even have interacted with before. Long story short, 9 months later, Twitter set up in Dublin. They've hired over 20 staff, and they're hiring more and more. And it's just cost nothing, and it just goes to show. And we're launching the Irish Spring 2 in January 2013, which is going to be a big public art project from a tourism point of view. So thank you. I totally agree with your comment about bottom-up innovation can be the most innovative. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
One more question?
Thank you for your presentation. I think one thing that, one challenge with this bottom-up approach is really being able to control the tool and convey a message that we want to convey rather than producing maybe opposite results. And this is something that, I mean, I think cultural diplomacy can function on different levels. That from the elite level, it has less credibility, I guess. And so I think the most powerful tool is bottom-up cultural diplomacy, obviously. But then sometimes the message can either be distorted or you have no control over the message. And I think this is sometimes a challenge with cultural diplomacy. And I don't know, how we can come up with a coherent, kind of strategy. I don't know to deliver the message that needs to be delivered.
I couldn't give you an answer to that question, but all I know very strongly is that it is indeed true that there is no way that these new media are going to be controlled. Like the old media, there used to be a sort of a filter. For instance, journals they had, or newspapers, there was a... But the interesting thing about Twitter and blog is that there is no way to control it. But still, they are very useful because their penetration to the audience is a lot faster, also probably a lot deeper than other traditional means of social communication.
Would you call that a strength instead of a challenge?
I would call that a strength.
No control.
Yeah, no control, because, it's the price we pay for, let's say, also you could call it the liberation of these new media. The price we pay is less control, but there is more vividness, there is more openness, also to, let's say, whatever would come from the bottom, I think, yes. And also, the price we also pay is that Twitter and blogs are also very useful for this other side of democracy, for displaying resentment and discontent. And that's the price we probably pay. And also there is no control. Sad to say.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Applause for Professor Koenis.
Oh, maybe if you want to have a copy of my lecture, send an email to my address. Thank you.